spring, the sun's out, everybody, they're like, are y'all having a party in there? I'm like, absolutely, we're having a party. Okay, so we will be calling the Board of the Directors regular meeting, February 27th, 2020, at 10:02 a.m. So our first item here is convene an executive session. Mayor Watts had requested that the board consider tabling this item for our next meeting. So what is the board's desire here?
Move to table.
Okay. Second, all in favor say aye. Aye. The vote was unanimous. So we will table that executive session. So that will start with our Pledge of Allegiance to the U.S. flags, our invocation, and welcome and introduction to visitors. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible. Father, we just thank you for this beautiful day, Lord, and all the things that remind us of your love for us. Father, I thank you for every family represented here in this room. Father, I ask that you put out your healing hand, Lord. There are so many that are ill at this time, and special requests for prayer for things going on this week and next week. So, Lord, I just ask that you would supernaturally heal all those who are ill, Father, that you would guide the doctors and nurses, Lord, as they care for your people, Lord. Father, that you are our healer, and Father, we put our trust in you. Father, I thank you for the opportunity and the responsibility that you've given us here today, Lord. Father, that we conduct ourselves in a way that is pleasing to you. Father, that you would guide us with your spirit to the decisions that need to be made here, Lord, and that it serve our region in a way that lifts us up and recognizes our region. Father, again, I thank you for all those here today, and we pray this in the name of your Son, our Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, and do we want to...
Well, because they're not here, I think
So,
what we do is just move.
because we had anticipated going into executive session, we had asked those that are going to be recognized today, Alan Harris and Michael Savoy, to be here at 10:30, because we were anticipating we were going to go into executive session. So we're actually going to hold that until they're able to come, and we can just go into our public comment. Yeah, ready? So this agenda item provides an opportunity for citizens to address the Board of Directors on any agenda items or other matters relating to DCTA. Anyone wishing to address the Board of Directors should complete a citizen comment registration card and submit it to the DCTA administration prior to the start of the Board Director meeting. There is a 3-minute time limit for each citizen. Anyone wishing to speak shall be courteous and cordial. The Board of Directors is not permitted to take any action on any subject raised by a speaker during citizen comments. However, the Board of Directors may have the item placed on future agenda items for action. Refer the item to DCTA administration for further study or action. Briefly state existing DCTA policy, or provide a brief statement of factual information in response to the inquiry. Do we have any requests? No, ma'am. Okay. Okay, so that takes us to our next agenda item, guest presenters. Raymond?
Yes, and we are fortunate to have Christoph Spieler, and he's joined by David Campbell, a vice president, both with Hewitt Zollers. As you may recall, we asked Christoph to come in and present to the board today, just his vision. He's definitely known in the industry as an expert when it comes to transportation planning, long-range planning. He's an author of a book, Vice President and Director of Planning for Hewitt Zollers. He leads the transportation and land planning projects around the United States. He's a senior lecturer at Rice University, where he teaches transportation. From 2010 through 18, he served on the board of directors of Houston Metro. So he has experience kind of on the opposite side of the seats here. And I'm just very pleased that he's honoring us today and is going to share some of the insights from his book. And I had an opportunity with staff to just bring him up to speed on some of the things that we're planning to do with our transformation initiative and things of that nature. So we'll hear him present and give you an opportunity to ask questions.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and to be talking to you and to have a room full of people who care about making transit better, because we really need it. So I come here from Houston. It's probably not what you imagine when you think of Houston. I live right here, I work right here, and here's the train that takes me to work every day. I managed to have a 10-block commute, and I have a transit line which gets me there faster than walking. And so transit makes my life better every day. That's why I care about this, is because transit is about making people's lives better. And transit also makes cities better. And there's some fundamental math to that. A bus or a train can hold a lot of people. And if we compare that to what a single occupant vehicle can do, we start to realize the efficiency of transit. All those cars put together are about 40 people. That little train over there, that's 400 people. That's what transit can do for cities. And a funny way to think about this is, in a typical office building, an office worker's cubicle is actually smaller than the space that's provided for their car in the parking garage. So your car has more space than you do.
How do you feel about that?
And because of that fundamental efficiency, transit is at the heart of every successful metropolitan area in the United States and the world. That is what transit can do. It can make life better. It can support the economy. And when that works, that really works. You have places like Toronto where you have these neighborhoods with good enough transit that a third of households have no cars. You have downtown Seattle, which in a period where they added 75% in population, 26% in jobs in downtown, they cut the number of cars driving into downtown by 20%. That's what good transit can accomplish. And that same good transit can do a lot of other things. It can be freedom for people who do not have the ability to drive for whatever reason, because they are young, because they are old, because they are in a wheelchair, because they can't afford a car. So a good transit network, the same thing that makes transit make better cities, also helps a lot of people every day. And I think it's really important to think about this. And one thing I would say for you as board members is one of the most important things a transit agency board can do is be really clear about what a transit agency is trying to accomplish. There's a lot of competing demands made of transit agencies. There's a lot of things asked of agencies that often are inherently conflicting. That's sort of the question of cover as much territory as possible or carry as many people as possible. You can't do both of those things. Transit agencies being asked to grow ridership or be more efficient, those things are often at odds with each other. So agencies making really clear decisions about what we are trying to accomplish leads to better transit. So what I did in the book is I looked at every metropolitan area in the United States that has rail or bus rapid transit, mapped all of them to the same scale, looked at how they are doing in terms of ridership, and really looked at what decisions did each area make and what were the results of those decisions. What is working and what isn't. And there's a surprising range looking at that. And then also in the book, I looked at how does transit work in the United States? How do we do things like funding and governance? What kind of technology do we use? And what are the keys to making transit successful? Because we've built a lot of transit in the United States. Here's rail construction in the United States year by year since World War II, and we are investing a lot of money in transit. But the results we get across that are not uniform. You see that some metropolitan areas perform far better than others. And some of that has to do with history. It's not surprising that a place like Philadelphia, for example, has high transit ridership because they were built around transit. They have that in their bones. But a lot of this is due to decisions that each of these areas make. And when I talk about those decisions, I'm not just talking about transit agencies making decisions. I'm talking about cities making decisions as well. Because both of those decisions put together shape what makes a successful transit system. And when I look at all of those cities, here's what I think the key factors are that determines what transit ridership looks like. Density, activity, walkability, connectivity, frequency, travel time, reliability, capacity, and leisure. These are true regardless of whether you're talking about a train or a bus. These are true regardless of whether you are talking about a big city or a small one, whether you're talking about urban development or suburban development. Because these come from the basics of transit technology, and they come from the basics of how human beings operate, what we look at when we decide to make the decision to ride or not. I think one of the basic things about transit is, in general, I think the public makes intelligent decisions about how to move around. If somebody's riding your system, it's because you're offering them a good alternative for that trip compared to the other choices they have. If somebody's not riding it, that's probably a sign that the service doesn't meet their needs. So let's go through these and talk about them. The first is density, and this is by far the most important. What density means is the more people are around a transit route, the more people will ride it. So here's Honolulu, for example, a strip of dense development between the mountains and the sea, and a transit system which serves that density. That's what works in terms of transit. The more people are next to every bus stop, the more people are next to every rail station, the more people will ride that transit system. And that density, it matters where it is. So we, for example, will map the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and generally we think of it like this. We're drawing lines on a map. But that's not actually what transit is, because transit works on the scale of stations. So what this map actually looks like is this. Every one of those circles is where you can get to from a DART or an A train or a TRE or a TEX rail station. And what's within those circles is what you have access to on transit. This is the level that density matters at. The ridership you get will be what is in every one of those circles. And you look at this map and you see, for example, that the DART rail planning missed some of this density. That there's places which are pretty near the rail lines, but not really within walking distance of a station. So one lesson you can look at this and say, you do your route planning and you put the stations in the right places. But you can also turn this around and say, every one of those circles is an opportunity. Everything we add inside of those circles that doesn't exist right now will make this transit system more useful. And that means transit planning is land use planning. Here's Portland, Oregon, and this is the Portland zoning map. This is famously one of the most transit-friendly cities in the United States, but everything in yellow is single-family zoning, which means the city of Portland is actually legally limiting how many people are allowed to live next to transit. Every development ordinance, every zoning ordinance is making decisions about how useful transit will be. And like I said, that means we have huge opportunities with land use. Here's a transit-oriented development in Northern Virginia. You can see a development that is built around transit. You can see that the experience of going to that building on that bus is going to be a great experience because the front door of the development is right where the transit is. When you get off that bus, you're in the middle of an interesting walkable place. So we have the chance to transform our cities around our transit and make them a lot more transit-friendly and a lot more vibrant and thriving and economically successful at the same time. This, for example, is the light rail line in Houston. Everything you see colored up here is development that happened after construction started on that light rail line. Houston has transformed around rail. And what's interesting about this is you're seeing a lot of that happen in places that already had activity. And I think that's a really useful lesson, that often some of this best development actually builds on stuff that's happening already. And when I think about downtown Louisville or I think about downtown Denton, you have those opportunities here. You have places that already have activity, that have train stations, that can have more things happen around them. Secondly, activity, because it's not just about where people live, it's where they're trying to go. Why is the rail line in Houston successful? Here's a major medical center. Here's a major downtown. It connects the two together. People are making trips to those kind of major activity centers. And if you look around the country, high-performing transit lines connect multiple centers together. Caltrain in San Francisco, and the highest ridership commuter rail lines in the United States. You've got Silicon Valley at one end. It's got downtown San Francisco at the other. It's got Stanford University along the way. Has a series of walkable downtowns along the way. connecting centers of activity together makes transit successful. And same goes if you look at urban rail lines. The reason why Boston's Green Line is one of the highest ridership light rail lines is it not just connects to downtown, goes to another employment center at Back Bay, goes to 3 major universities, it goes to a medical district. Every place has multiple centers. And I think often in transit planning, we're very downtown focused. Like I think there are a lot of regional rail planning in this region has been very focused on downtown Dallas. Every hospital, every university is a major activity center, and if you bring transit there, people will ride it. But you have to get that right. You have to get the stations in the right places. Here's Houston, 3 stops in the Texas Medical Center. You can see the walkable circles around them, quarter mile, half a mile. In purple are the actual institutions of the medical center. Those stops put together 13,500 boardings. Here is the Dallas equivalent. A medical center that actually has more jobs than Houston, but instead of 13,000 boardings, that's only about 3,000. Why is that? The stations are at the edge of things, not in the middle. Look at all those hospitals up there that aren't even within walking distance. When I rode the train up here this morning, you can look out the windows of light rail and see the hospitals you can't get to on that train. And that decision that was made then on where to build that rail line determined how useful that would be. And you see more and more cities actually really thinking about this, deliberately putting transit into the places where the activity is and will be. This is Redmond and Bellevue, Washington, and that's an entire corridor that they're redeveloping and making sure the transit is at the heart of it as they redevelop it. And it's important to realize that most of the trips we make every day are not home to work trips. Only about a quarter of trips are commute trips. And if you think about somebody's day, maybe that's what you have to do over the course of a day. If transit won't let you make all of those trips, you may not be able to make any of them on transit. Say, for example, transit can get you to work, but you have to go to a meeting over the course of the day, and that meeting is someplace you can't get to on transit. You're going to have to drive to work. Say you need to bring your kid to school in the morning, that might influence that you need a car for the entire day. One of the big lessons here is I think transit systems have tended to focus far too much on 9 to 5 commute and not thought about all of these other trips. And there's real potential there. In Houston, when we redesigned the bus network, one of the things we did is actually focused on getting weekend frequency to match weekday. Every route is as frequent on a Sunday morning as it is midday on a Monday. And the result of that was we actually, within the first 12 months, got 33% ridership growth on Sundays. The people needed that service. We weren't providing it, but the people needed it. So thinking about transit as something that's there all day for all sorts of trips makes transit a lot more useful. Next, let's talk about walkability, because every transit trip either begins or ends as a walking or biking trip. Even if you are park and riding, you will not have a car waiting for you at the other end of the trip. And this is when we start talking about first mile, last mile. Getting people from their stations to their destinations is absolutely critical. And by far the best first mile, last mile technology ever invented by human beings is the sidewalk. It is low cost to build, it has very low operating costs, and it works incredibly well. And that means we really need to think about the pedestrian environment around every one of our stations. In Houston, we built a $300 million light rail line, and that was the sidewalk we had leading to the station. Post-redevelopment, that is the same spot right now. That sidewalk is making that transit system more useful and making that transit system more pleasant. And this is something we should be thinking about in all development. And again, we've now gotten to a place where the transit agency doesn't control the whole trip. A transit trip is door to door, not bus stop to rail station. And if transit agencies and cities work together to make that part of the experience great, transit will be more useful and more people will ride it. And that includes just basic network connectivity. Right here, downtown Houston, this is your theoretical half-mile walkable circle, what you can do in 10 minutes. This light color shows you what you can actually do in 10 minutes. It's a nice connected street grid. So basically nearly every place in that circle is actually accessible to you. There is suburban Chicago and the same thing. And you will notice that because of a simple lack of street connectivity, most of the stuff within this circle isn't even reachable by transit. There's a great example of two backyards in Florida where the houses border each other, and the shortest distance between the two is 5 miles, simply because the streets don't connect. Again, this is the kind of thing where we're thinking about urban planning, not just about transit, but about how transit fits into a city. And good transit lines will take advantage of this. Make sure that those stops are right in the middle of the walkable places rather than somewhere on the edge. Connectivity. We talk about transit lines, but transit operates in systems. So this, for example, the light rail line in Houston, don't think of it just as a light rail line. Think of it as all of the bus routes that actually connect into that line. That's what makes that useful. And so that means we can think about how those routes work together. In Houston, for example, we moved to a grid of bus routes. Every route highlighted in yellow here does not actually go to downtown Houston, but it connects to the rail lines that do, and it connects to all of those other centers in the city. So thinking about how a network connects together makes it a lot more useful. And here's a good example, Kansas City streetcar, one of the highest ridership of the modern streetcar lines in the United States. And that's because it connects two centers, like you can see right here. Here's Crown Plaza, there's downtown, nice straight line between them. But it is also because it works incredibly well with the bus network. Here you can see frequent bus service in Kansas City, and you can see the streetcar. Every one of those bus routes makes the streetcar more useful by going places the streetcar doesn't. And the streetcar makes every one of those bus routes more useful by being a connection to places that that bus route doesn't go to. And so don't think of this as this by itself or this by itself. They all go together. And that's absolutely true here too. If you ride the A train, you see the buses waiting at the stations. What you're seeing is a connected system that works together rather than a rail line that works in isolation. And you're seeing more and more cities take advantage of that. For example, Richmond, Virginia implemented a new BRT route and then redesigned their entire bus network around it so that that new line served the most people possible by being integrated into a larger network. But that also means you have to think about those transfer spots. You're changing from a train to a bus or a bus to a bus. Is that safe? Is that comfortable? Is that sheltered when it's raining? That basic passenger experience of making a connection is really important. And good connection points really feel great. Here's an example in Munich, Germany, where you've got a train, you've got a bus. Notice how they're all under the same roof. Notice how they all have full passenger information. Think about how good that makes that transfer feel. And it's also about fares, which I think is actually saying the Metroplex is doing well. This is an example of how to do it badly. This is Philadelphia. The color you see there is the cost to get to downtown Philadelphia. And how much it costs you will depend on whether you take a bus or a train. It will depend on which agency you are riding on. And it will also depend on whether you make a transfer or not. This is a case of fares making transit harder to use. The actual understanding the fare system, the buying your fare media, makes this system harder to operate. And good systems are seamless through fares. So Germany, for example, they have something called the Verkehrsverbund, where they say all the transit agencies in a region, let's set the same fares, let's use the same fare media. So one of the things, like I said, that works really well up here is I've got a regional day pass in my pocket right now. And I can ride 4 different transit agencies with one piece of paper in my pocket. That makes transit more useful to people. Okay, next, frequency. Anyone who rides transit knows this is absolutely key. That what makes people ride transit is if it's there for them when they need it. So here, for example, Chicago, we've got a bus to downtown Chicago, we've got a train to downtown Chicago, and we're all assuming, we all probably think that trains are better than buses, so people are going to ride the train. But if you look at this, 1,000 people ride that bus route and 100 people ride that train. Why is that? In the middle of the day, you're going to wait no more than about 15 minutes for a bus. You could wait up to an hour for the next train. Frequency is what makes transit useful. And if you think about what an hourly bus route means, for example, that means you might have the choice of, I have to be either 5 minutes late or 55 minutes early. You literally have to plan your life around that service. Whereas if that service is frequent, you just show up when you want to go, and it's going to be there when you need it. And that really shows up. Las Vegas, Nevada has unusually high transit ridership among its peers, and it's not because it has a snazzy monorail. It's because its frequent bus network actually covers the population very well. That's where that ridership is coming from, simply running the service frequently enough in places that have the density to justify it, in places that have the demand to justify it. And you see that on things like commuter rail as well. One of the highest performing commuter rail lines in the United States is this one in Denver, running through open prairie. And at first, this does not look like a good formula for ridership. That is the airport you see in the distance, but even airport rail connections often underperform. However, this is the most frequent commuter rail line in the United States. It's got service every 15 minutes, 7 days a week. When you provide good service, people use it. Travel time. Notice I am not saying speed here. What matters in transit is travel time door to door. So think about what it takes to make a trip. You walk on one end, then you wait, then you ride, then you walk on the other end. How do we make a transit trip faster? We try speeding up the vehicle, for example. That sounds like it might be good, but if we're speeding it up by actually moving it out of the way, say by putting it on the freeway rather than on a street, what that might mean is I have a longer walk distance at the other end, and my trip just actually got longer, even though the bus got faster, or even though the train got faster. Or I can say, let's stop less, which generally is a really good idea to have fewer stops, except if I really make those walking distances too long, now you have a lot of passengers who are having longer trips as a result. So when we think about speed, we should always think about that trip time. And one of the things it comes down to is speed is about putting transit in the right places. You put transit in the middle of things, it will actually result in faster trips. And it's also about the planning of routes themselves. Here's what we did in Houston. The most frequent routes are the straightest. They aren't making little detours into neighborhoods. They aren't trying to serve the front door of the community center. The routes that the most people ride are as straight a line as possible, so people get where they're going as quickly as possible. So here's the 15-minute routes. Same goes for the 30-minute routes, straight lines. And then those places where the bus has to get out of its way, that's where we use different kinds of services. That's where we use hourly buses. That's where we use on demand. So the high ridership routes, as straight as possible to make them as fast as possible. And where speed matters is between things. So that, for example, if you're building a rail line, if you want to go from Santa Fe to Albuquerque, it absolutely makes sense to put in the freeway and go fast between the cities. But at the end, where people are actually trying to go to, you want to put it in the middle of things. And you think about how different services overlay. This is San Francisco. You're standing on a street corner, you see a streetcar, you see a light rail train. They are going to exactly the same place. The light rail train's about to get in the subway and go under downtown. The streetcar is going to be on the same street on the surface. Why two transit lines in the same corridor? Because they're serving different needs. If you're coming from the outer neighborhoods, you want that trip to be faster. And so light rail is going to get you there quicker in the subway. But if you're just moving within downtown, the streetcar stops more often. It's on the surface. You don't have to go down to catch it. So if you're making a short trip, the streetcar will actually be more useful to you. So good transit networks actually overlay different services on top of each other. And think about their regional express services and their local services. They're serving different needs. They're connecting together to become one system. But it's not just about travel time. It's also about reliability. Because reliability is what causes people to lose their jobs. If your bus doesn't show up on time, if your bus doesn't drop you off on time, that's the thing that's really going to make transit not work for you. So how do we make transit reliable? This is a bus route in Minneapolis, and what it spends its actual time doing. 23% of the time at a red light, 32% of the time boarding, 42% of the time moving or in traffic. How do we change all of those? So we've got traffic congestion. We give transit its own lane. We give transit its own track. We get transit out of traffic. And this makes sense, obviously, in big cities, but it can also make sense in all sorts of places. Sometimes you have specific nodes of congestion in like tight little downtowns, for example, where just a few blocks of bus lane can make a huge difference. You even look at things like traffic signals. Here's a bus in Grand Rapids, Michigan that's about to turn left from the right-hand lane because this traffic signal has a special bus-only phase. That means the bus can stop at a bus stop right before the intersection. It means the bus driver doesn't have to merge over and contend with traffic. Just that little move will make that route more reliable. And it's the things you do at stations. How good is your boarding? This is an example in Chicago of level boarding, but even really simple things. Bus stops that have better ADA wheelchair pads, that have more concrete at the stop, it's going to take less time to load someone in a wheelchair, and that bus will be more likely to stay on time as they do that. So every bus stop makes a difference here. How you collect fares makes a difference. How long does it take people to board? And then capacity, I think this is one that we tend to overestimate a lot. We talk about high capacity transit, but in reality, in most of the time in the United States, capacity isn't the limiting factor. What we're really thinking about, because transit is so efficient to start with, what we're really thinking about is what kind of quality of service we provide. So there are some places where we are stretching bus routes too far in terms of their capacity. There are some rail lines that are completely overcrowded, like here in Boston. But generally, transit is really good at capacity. Generally, this isn't the problem we're trying to solve. And then finally, legibility. And I think this is one that we underestimate a lot, because it's harder to measure. But this is an example of a legible transit system. I'm in Santa Monica right here. I can see where I'm trying to go. That's the arch that leads me to the beach. I can see the path that will get me there. That's that nice sidewalk. I can see the transit, and the transit is telling me where it's going. I can understand a transit system. I am much more likely to use it. And generally, we tend to design transit systems that work well for people who make the same exact trip every day. We don't do this well for new riders, for someone who's trying to figure this out for the first time. And we don't do it well either for people who make different trips every day. And that's actually a lot of people, like a good example, home health care aides are frequently making different trips to different places, and if they can't figure out the system, it won't work for them. And so some of that is branding. This is one of my favorite examples, the Roaring Fork Transit Authority in Colorado with their Velociraptor service. You make service distinctive, you give it a clear name, it will help people understand it. But it's lots of other things too. Here's a bus stop in the Twin Cities, and it's remarkable what this bus stop's doing for you. First of all, the route is simple, and the route is frequent, but notice that this bus stop has every bit of information I need to understand this route. It's got schedule, it's got information on fares, it's got a map of the route. Notice that the bus stop has a name. One of the things that makes rail easier to navigate than bus is rail stations have names and bus stops don't, but there's no reason why bus stops can't have names. It tells me which direction it's going. I would say probably 3/4 of the bus stops don't have that information. They don't tell you, is this the northbound bus or the southbound bus? Imagine if we did that for interstates. Imagine if the sign just said 35, and it didn't tell you whether it was going north or south. We were just expected to understand that.
We still get mixed up.
It's got real-time passenger information. It tells you when the bus is actually coming. This beacon will start flashing when the bus approaches. What this is a very legible transit experience. It's things like maps. Here's the Houston system map, and the color coding will actually tell you how frequently each of these routes operate. Red is every 15 minutes, blue is every 30, green is every hour. I can make better decisions about how to get somewhere just by looking at this map. And it's the routes themselves. This is one of my favorite examples. This is St. Paul, Minnesota. Every one of these colors is a different bus route number, and every line is a different variant of that bus. So for example, the number 64 bus here, there's like 5 different variations of them. I can stand on this street and there's one version of the 64 that runs north to go downtown and another one that runs south. If we're expecting people to figure out systems like this, they will not ride transit. We're expecting people to figure out routes like that one. This is City of Commerce, California. That route takes an hour to make that circle. It runs every hour and a half. There's probably like one person on that bus, and you can tell. Why would I go from there to there if I did that? And this goes to a point of sometimes transit is about picking the appropriate technology for something. And this is a case where a 40-foot bus was clearly not the appropriate technology to serve this transit need. And I think one thing smart transit agencies are looking at is understand the travel needs, understand where a bus is the best solution, understand where rail is the best solution, and understand where an on-demand service may be the best one. I had a great trip here today, actually. I spent the night in downtown Dallas, took DART, took the A train, and then connected to the Connect Zone at the station, and it did this very well in a way that I couldn't imagine a local bus route in this same business park doing the same trip as well. And so good transit actually follows the shape of it is. Good transit is easier to understand because the transit routes match the structure of the cities themselves. In Houston, we have the Gessner bus, it goes the full length of Gessner. We have the Antoine bus, it goes the length of Antoine. If you understand the city, you can understand the transit system. And one more point, inclusivity. A good transit system is welcoming to everybody. And this means thinking about a whole range of users who have a whole different set of issues using that transit system. And a really good example I think of all the time is stroller policies on transit. There's an awful lot of transit systems whose rule is, you're riding with a stroller, you are required to fold the stroller before boarding. Now let's think about that. You got one hand to hold your folded stroller, you got one hand to hold your kid, and your third hand is there to actually tap the fare box in the glee. That policy is making transit less welcoming to anybody traveling with kids. Think about the wide range of people who use transit, and think about what will make them feel welcome, feel comfortable, feel included on that system. What's interesting about this whole list of things is that they're very obvious if you actually use transit. None of this is rocket science, but if you look at the actual ridership on transit across the United States, you will see a huge range there. I would argue that transit planning is actually quite simple, but that we often don't do it very well at all. So for example, you look at this. How do you plan transit? You figure out where the density is, you figure out where the centers are, you draw straight lines between them. But then you look across the United States and we do an awful lot of this. We do an awful lot of putting transit in places where you know it won't get ridership. That cornfield is not going to lead to high ridership. So why do we do that? And here you can actually see the pattern. There's Dallas, for example, and you can see how the rail lines actually miss the density. Look at Denver up here. What we're seeing here is a pattern where a lot of times, I liken this to like airliners dodging thunderstorms. The train sort of heads towards the density and then curves away at the last moment. So how do we do better transit planning? First of all, I think we talk too much about modes. We have way too much bus versus rail discussion. It's about a connected system. We should be talking about what kind of service are we trying to provide, what kind of places are we trying to connect, what kind of trips are we trying to serve, and then pick technology that actually does that well. We think about single-purpose transit. This is a commuter train in New Jersey, and part of the problem with it is we call it a commuter train. And what that means is the people doing transit planning in New Jersey think of this as a train that's designed to get 9 to 5 white-collar professionals to Manhattan. And that's the purpose of this train. And everything about it, the schedules, the fares, the design of the stations is all based around that. And the problem with that is there's actually a lot of other trips. There's a lot of other things this train could be doing. And by planning transit for only one kind of trip, we're getting it wrong. And I think the A train's a good example. I mean, you can think of that only as that's a service to connect you to the end of DART to get you to Dallas, but couldn't that train be a real asset for trips within Denton County? And if you do the right development around the stations and you do the right connections to those stations, that train can serve a whole lot of other kinds of trips that it's not serving right now. We hurry through system planning. We tend to spend a lot of detail in doing individual routes, but don't do that same thinking for the system as a whole, which is really the most important question for a transit agency. What does your whole network look like? We don't think about networks. We don't think about how all of these lines connect together and form one coherent network. We don't use the data that we have. First of all, sometimes we don't collect the data, which from what I've heard from Raymond and others, like there seems to be a gap here in terms of just collecting basic ridership data. Like that's a really important thing for a transit agency to do. And then we can use that data to make better decisions about where to run service. We think at too large a scale. We're often drawing lines that look really impressive on a map and not thinking about the details of how they actually work together. And we think way too much about path and not destinations. I mean, that is the DART rail system built along existing freight rail lines because it was easy to build there. But when you look at what's around the station, it's what was around freight rail lines, namely warehouses, which is not where people are actually traveling to. And we avoid opposition. This is an example from Houston. 2 possible rail alignments. This one goes right through the middle of neighborhoods, right by the university, right through the major employment center. This one follows an old railroad corridor and power lines. every time we try to build transit into the middle of somewhere, there will be somebody pushing back. And I think it's often the job of a board to be the one saying, no, this is important. I mean, I got a lot of that pushback on, we don't want that bus route going down our street. Can't you just detour it around our entire neighborhood? One of my rules of transit planning is, if you propose a transit route and nobody is against it, it's a bad project. Because it means you're not building in any place that actually matters. And all of that opposition is real. All of those concerns you hear are real. And there's something you need to deal with. This is good design. This is good planning. This is thinking about how to address those concerns. But ultimately, good transit means putting it in the right places. And sometimes that means making politically hard decisions. When I look around the United States, I can see a lot of gaps in our transit networks. But I can also see a lot of opportunities. I see places that have the density to merit frequent service that don't have it right now. I see places that have multiple activity centers that we aren't connecting well enough. I see underused infrastructure that could be doing a lot more than it's doing right now. I think we can really improve the transit experience everywhere. We can improve the transit experience in Houston, we can improve the transit experience in New York, we can improve the transit experience in Louisville. That we have a lot of opportunity to make transit a lot more useful to more people. Again, we really have to focus on the goals. We have to think about what we're trying to accomplish. And here, you know, even you look at Denton County, there is some real opportunities for ridership up here. But to get there, what we have to do is not think about trains and buses, but think about people. Think about who we're actually trying to serve and how that transit will make their lives better. And with that, I'm happy to answer your questions.
The one thing, and you got just right at the end there of your list of things that make it a better system, basically. The experience really is, I think, where I went to on all that. You went through all those. I started thinking about my experience in other cities, whether it be New York or San Francisco or whatever, and making that a comfortable, nice experience, whether it be just more comfortable seats or whether you got Wi-Fi or whatever it is. But we had not the best experience in San Francisco, like on the trolley car or whatever, just with the people that were on there. And some things that we encountered, and smells, and different things that happen that it's an experience you don't want to necessarily have. So I think that's a big piece of it as well.
Yeah, no, and I will say, I mean, that I always love riding transit in other cities and like thinking through like, what kind of experience am I having here? Is this working for me? Is it not working for me? And you're right, it's often a lot of stuff that's hard to measure, and you can really tell the difference sometimes when you ride a well-run system, you ride a system that isn't run as well. The basic maintenance, how attentive are the drivers? How often are the vehicles cleaned? Lots of things like that make a real difference. And so I think you got it exactly right. You think about it from the rider standpoint. You think about what experience is that rider having, and that leads you to make better decisions. And I think one of the problems in a lot of the world of transit is we've traditionally focused too much on how we operate the service rather than what experience we provide. Like I think there's definitely a school of thought among some transit operations people that their job is to run buses down the street, and passengers are these annoying people who get in the way of doing that job. And I understand that. I mean, running buses down the street is a really hard thing to do, but I think one of the things a good transit agency does is always keep focused on that passenger experience.
Well, I want to thank you, and I would say that the timing of this is perfect in my opinion, because as we think about what lies before us in the next few months, we're going to go through a transformation initiative. And one of the first things you said is we really need to have clarity around what our purpose is. So if we, I would say in board past, it was, the guidance to staff was, we need to grow ridership, we need to grow ridership. And you can grow ridership, to Christoph's point, by adding a lot of frequency, but that also adds a lot of cost. And so when you look at the metrics of cost per rider, cost per mile, cost per trip, you might increase ridership 10 or 14, 15%, which sounds good, but it might cost you twice as much. And I would say that when you look at DCTA, it started with a bus company that was running in Denton predominantly. And then there was a forcing function that created DCTA, which was to build a rail line. And you mentioned this earlier, that transit agencies aren't really great at, they're great at building things. So we made DCTA to build the A-Train system,
Yeah.
and then we bolted on a bus system that existed for the last 14 or 15 years. We really haven't optimized around a lot of the principles that you talked about here around people and travel patterns and things of that nature. We've really tried to optimize. The last time we did this, we hired consultants, and the direction from the board and from staff was increase ridership. So when you talk about increasing ridership, you're looking at adding a lot of frequency and service, but it may not be effective, and we've created longer routes. And so as we move into the transformation initiative, one of the first things that I'm hopeful that we do is get board guidance as to what are the goals, so that we're optimizing for the outcome that you're looking for. And there's a lot of wisdom and transit agencies that have gone before us that have done this, so it's not like it's going to be magic or hard to get to. It's just understanding what the priorities are, and then going through a very systematic, thoughtful way of planning transit. I like what you say, which is there's a lot of trips that don't really need to be going down into Dallas. We can leverage the train system and the bus system to provide trips within Denton County, and that's what I'm looking forward to. So thank you very much for being here today and sharing your thoughts. Any other questions for Christoph at this point?
Christoph, you said that efficiency and ridership are often at odds with each other. More on that.
So, I mean, it's how you would, I think you just put it very well. It's like, what are you measuring? And if your directive to the agency staff is all we are measuring is ridership numbers, the solution to that is to put more service out there, some of which may not be carrying a lot of people. It's adding to those ridership numbers. Like every increment you do, you're adding to those numbers. And then you turn around and you ask, what is your cost effectiveness? And no, your cost effectiveness just got worse by doing that, by adding more service in places where the ridership return wasn't going to be big. But if all you're looking at the bottom line ridership and you aren't comparing that to the service you're providing, then that's how you solve it. So I think that's the key point here is, it is the role of a board to give the management clear guidance on what are we trying to accomplish and how can we measure that. And when we do that well, that's a really good conversation within a board of figuring out what those goals are, figuring out what those metrics are, and a really good meeting of minds with the people who are in charge of delivering on those.
And to your point, we've increased ridership on our Connect bus service the last couple of years. But we have a severe driver shortage, and it's not one that DCTA has. I think you probably hear this around the country, right? There's
Yep.
a severe driver shortage. And so while we've added frequency and we've added bus service, we're letting our customers down. The experience is not good because we can't put enough people on the routes to provide the frequency. And so it is it hurts our bus operators, and they're working too much overtime. Our cost of overtime is really high. We have a lot of open positions, and so you can imagine the thrashing that's going on with HR people trying to hire people.
Yep.
And we're losing them faster than we're able to hire them. And so we have to stop the chaos a bit here and say, for now, as we get into the transformation initiative, that's going to take us 4, 5, 6 months. There are things that we can be doing now to help this agency and help our staff and help our operators so that they're not having to work so many hours. And that's by looking at the existing service, and we're going to need to cut back on some of the service. The direction a few years ago was increase ridership. I think what we need to do, and what I've been hearing from our board, is become more efficient and become more effective and make sure that we're putting the dollars to the best use. And that to me says, pull back on some of the frequency that you have out there, do it effectively, but we can't continue to do what we're doing because we're not efficient right now. We're not effective, and part of that is when you have a transition like we did to take it from a private provider to public, or this happens everywhere you go. There's a lot of inefficiency that happens when you make a transition like that. But I would say that the next 6 months are paramount to the future of this agency. You have the full commitment of staff to do what is in the best interest of this agency, to use the dollars efficiently, to bring consultants in, to advise us on how to plan our future. But between now and then, staff is going to be asking you, including today, to make some changes to get us, to bridge us to that point, because we have operators that are just working way too many hours, and we have too many unfilled positions, and we're not delivering the service anyway. So over the next 4 to 5 months, we'll be bringing back to you some options for us to limit the amount of service that we're trying to put out on the street.
As a note to add to that, Raymond, I recently got back from an APTA marketing communications conference. And this is the first time, this is my 6th one to attend, this is the first time that there have been sessions dedicated to the national epidemic of not enough operators and not enough mechanics. It's the first time from a marketing communications perspective that they have had sessions that have gone like in depth on these issues and how it's affecting systems. So that was kind of very eye-opening to me, that, you know, that now they're bringing marketers into it to kind of have that discussion, because the HR departments just aren't robust enough to handle the amount of shortage that there is.
No, I think it's absolutely a national problem on the operator shortage, and there are other industries trying to hire those people who frankly offer easier work for the same pay, and that is a real problem, and I would totally underline that. Promising service you can't deliver is the easiest way to lose a customer. Like promising frequency, then not having the operators to deliver it and actually canceling those runs, which is what places like Denver are doing. So there's people waiting at a bus stop for a bus that will never show up since there wasn't somebody available to drive it. Once you have gotten that far down the road, you are going to be alienating customers. So being proactive about that. And it's about focusing. It's about saying, where can this service be most effective, be most useful, and let's concentrate our resources there.
When you talk about concentrating the resources and frequency, and I wonder, do we look at, because I know that there's S-curve and all that, with frequency, are you better to keep higher frequency on fewer routes, or reduce the frequency on more and have more routes? But I'm kind of hearing you say you're better with the higher frequency.
Well, again, it depends what your goal is. So what you're talking about here is two competing goals. One is growing ridership and efficiency of, like, we want to carry as many people as possible with the resources we have. The other goal is, here are areas where we believe we need to provide service. And that can be a sort of geographic argument of, we're paying into the system and we want something out of it, or it could be a sort of lifeline service argument of, there are some people in this neighborhood who are dependent on the service and we need to provide it. And so those are your competing goals there. If your goal is, we want to carry as many people as possible with a limited amount of resources, and every transit agency has a limited amount of resources, then what you will do is you will focus in those corridors where the demand is highest and provide the highest quality service. And you have some of those markets here. I mean, universities are places where if you put in good service, you tend to get really good ridership. Students move to places where there is good transit service. Students use that service. But that doesn't mean those other goals aren't valid goals as well. That saying there are people in this neighborhood who are dependent on transit service and we need to provide them with a route. So that's why you end up seeing systems provide different kinds of service in different places. But I also think that's where you start having discussions about tools, where you start having discussions about, is a full-size bus the best way to serve that need? And that's something you're doing already, is using different kinds of services in different places. And I think the Transformation Initiative is a real good chance to ask that question of, where does a standard bus route make sense? Where does a flex zone make sense? What level of train service do we need? And how does it all fit together? But if you want to start by really trying to decide what you're going to accomplish, and then the staff can tell you which tools will do that the best.
Well, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was very interesting, eye-opening. I think we're seeing a lot of changes in transportation that we hadn't seen before. In fact, APTA called it transformation because it's huge things that are coming that we need to consider. So thank you so much for coming and sharing all this with us.
One question, where can we find your book?
Amazon.com, just search for Trains, Buses, People. Or you can go to islandpress.org, which is my publisher. You can buy it there as well. And I should also point out I'm Christoph Spieler on Twitter. So if you want to see me talk transit and see pictures of transit in all sorts of places, you can find that as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both for being here.
So we now have our recognition of service here. So Alan's here and Michael for Raymond.
Yes. We'll start with Alan. Alan, why don't you join me up here? This is a bittersweet process, but I really enjoy it because it gives us an opportunity to honor, in my opinion, elected officials and board members that serve. It's not only the individual, but it's your families that give of your time. And I try to serve and give back as well. And I want to take this time, and I think it's important that we do this because DCTA has always made a history of honoring past board members because you do give of your time. And it's not just the time that you spend here, but it's the time that you spend poring over all the documents and providing your insight and your brilliance and excellence. And Alan has done that for 7 years, very dedicated to DCTA. He's been instrumental in our offsite strategic plans, engaging with the colony, providing some mind share and some leadership with regard to the BNSF line as it comes into Frisco in the future. There's been a lot of advanced planning that's been done by BNSF and by the COG, and they continue to move that forward. And a lot of it has to do with the cities that are represented along that rail line. Alan has served both on our the Finance Committee and our Program Services Committees in the past. And I just want to thank you on behalf of staff and of the board for the 7 years of dedicated service and stewardship from DCTA. So thank you so much. Thank you.
It's funny, when I first got on the board, I'd come from serving for a decade in the colony on city council, which was, when I first initially got there, was we want nothing to do with DCTA. Everything's going north. We don't want to go north. The residents want to go south. And then I got involved in TML, and then I got on the board there. And I was on the board of COG, and I started understanding regionalization a little bit more, and started seeing what the benefit of that is. And then when I got off council, the person council said is, we want you to go sit on the DCTA board and watch them. Just let us know what's going on. But they hadn't realized that I'd sort of embraced regionalization a little bit, and I've been converted to mass transit. I certainly am a friend of DCTA, and certainly am a supporter of true regionalization through the area. I thank you for the opportunity to serve, and who knows, maybe again someday.
Thank you, Alan.
Michael, I'd like to ask you to come up. Michael has served DCTA for 2 years. When he joined, Michael Sawah was new, and I thought, well, who is this guy? Where does he come from? I'd heard a lot about your background in business and education, and I would say that all of us, as I've talked to our chair, have just been incredibly impressed with your knowledge, your gentle hand, but also the timing of when you say things have always added a lot of value. And so while you've only been here 2 years and served 2 years, the 2 years that you served were just very, very beneficial to staff. I certainly appreciated, I know our staff has appreciated your leadership and the governance and stewardship, and I want to thank you so much for your service. Absolutely.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to serve with you. It's been my pleasure to serve with each and every one of you. I'm very impressed with the work that you're doing, and I encourage you to continue to do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So, we're going to have our representatives here from Hillco and come up and introduce themselves and so let's go ahead and.
Lindsay, you want to
Lindsay's
give a little
gonna do
background?
Yeah.
Presentation.
Background.
Yeah, I'll just do a real quick intro. Really appreciate Rick Dennis and Kate Coleman being here today. They came up from Austin to visit. The board approved our agreement with them to provide legislative consulting services to assist us as we gear up for the legislative session that will begin in January 2021, which is shockingly around the corner. And they are just going to do a brief presentation about who they are as a firm, the value that they bring to our agency as we get more and more engaged in our legislative initiatives and down in Austin with our legislators. And then also give you all a brief overview of the political landscape and just kind of what to expect as we get through this electoral season. So with that, I'll pass it.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Great.
Rick Dennis and
Coleman.
Kate Coleman, recognizing that we might be what's standing between y'all and lunch. We will strive to be informative, but also brief. But side note, when I go back to Austin, I am going to be measuring the space of my parking space. in my
Yeah,
office.
exactly.
With that, Kate's going to kick us
Great.
off.
So we'll give a quick overview to start. Just a quick about Hillco. First of all, great to see some of you that we've seen before and new faces. We had Buddy Jones, who is one of the founding members of our Hillco partners, could not be here, and he sends his regrets, but had a long-standing conflict with today. So we'll hopefully be able to meet some of you in the future. Hillco was founded in 1998 by two founding partners, Buddy Jones and Bill Miller. They're still active in the practice today and running Hillco. It has grown since then to include about 15 lobbyists total, as well as a strong support staff, and we'll go through kind of that. But the lobby represents a lot of experience, years of experience, areas of experience, lots of different backgrounds, and bring a lot of different, just different backgrounds, different experience to the table. So it's a really great team, of which Rick and I are two. They're collectively, again, this just kind of talks about the different experience that everyone represents, the expertise. We have people from the Capitol that have worked in the Capitol, people from various different governmental relations and legal experience and background. Are you manning that? We are a full-service lobby team, so we do everything from governmental relations team. We do everything from lobbying to public policy. Again, a lot of people have a lot of experience in very specific and broad policy areas. Communications, we have a full-service research and communications team that supports the work that we do for various clients, and then a regulatory arena. In addition to having people that have worked in the Capitol, we have people from all areas of state government, and a good showing there. We focus on working with our clients from a very both broad strategic perspective and also down to a very tailored approach. So as we start to work with DCTA, we'll talk about that in just a minute, some of the work that we're already doing and some of the work that we'll do going forward. That will certainly be a part of our goals and efforts. Just a quick little bit on what sets us apart. I talked a little bit about our support staff and the research and communications team, but we do have a really robust research and communications team that works with us on all of our clients. They do everything from track legislation as it's moving through the process, to track issues as they're changing rapidly outside of the legislative session and inside any different governmental area that we're working on. They're working on elections right now, keeping us very on top of a lot of information as that unfolds. And they produce reports on everything that's going on in that process. And so some of the stuff that we have already shared with DCTA, some of the reports on interim hearings that are being held right now, election reporting, that sort of stuff will continue to produce and be something that's in front of you.
And I'll add, as it relates to the reports that they provide, we've not been sharing those because we wanted to give Hilco an opportunity to come and present to the board first, let you get familiar with them, and from this point forward, we will start sharing those reports with you in the Friday email.
Again, we have 15 registered lobbyists, and while we do all represent a very diverse background, have a lot of different experience, we work together really collaboratively as a team. I think that one of the strengths of Hilco is that it's just big enough to have a lot of experience and expertise in different areas, but also small enough that we all really know each other well. We work together a lot. So while Rick is really your daily point of contact, and I support him in that role, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the others kind of daily on the team, the full team of registered lobbyists and the 15, everyone at Hilco, including the support staff, are working on your issues and what's going on every day. So as your issues might move into an area that perhaps Rick and I aren't experts on, we'll have someone to tap for that, and that's a great asset. Your quick core DCTA team, again, mentioned Rick and I. Rick has experience working with members in this area, both as the Chief of House and the Chief of Staff in the Texas House, and with Senator Pat Fallon as an advisor to him. He's also worked with, and is just through all of his work in those capacities, has worked with other members and knows a lot about the area. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Rick?
That's good.
I have experience at both the state and federal level on both transportation and a lot of other issues as well, education and some others. So the rest of the team, again, Buddy Jones, our founding partner, who we hope we'll be able to meet soon in the future, has an immense amount of experience in Austin and the state of Texas. I once heard him described to me as kind of a force of his own, and he certainly is that, and he brings a lot to the table and certainly leads us very capably. Jay McCart, also he's one of the 6 partners at Hilco, and he has a lot of experience in the transportation area as a senior staff to Rick Perry, and has worked on a lot of different transportation clients in the past.
Before we get into real quick the Texas House landscape, I just want to say, Kate mentioned earlier, my background primarily exists with Tan Parker and Pat Fallon, and my 10 years working for Representative Parker prior to joining Hilco Partners really afforded me the opportunity to get to know DCTA from the standpoint of 2 different levels of public service, the state representative's office, and then of course the on the ground, what DCTA is doing on a day-to-day basis to help move people throughout the county. And worked on legislation with past members of the DCA team in previous legislative sessions, and just want to say from a personal standpoint, very honored to have this opportunity to work with you guys again. One of the things, of course, that we want to make sure you guys are fully apprised on is, even though it's the interim portion of the 2-year process, there is still a lot going on in Austin, and this, of course, has been a far more active interim than what we have historically seen in the past. Right now, the Texas House is a very interesting sandbox, currently comprised of 83 Republicans and 67 Democrats. You guys might be aware that those numbers are tighter than what they historically have been for the past decade, where Republicans had been enjoying majorities that numbered 95, sometimes even all the way up to 101 members of their party in the 150-member chamber. But the 2018 election sort of tightened things up a little bit, and the 2020 election could be a second step in that process. Currently, there are 13 vacancies in the State House. That's actually a little bit low. Usually we average somewhere between 18 or so House members that decide on their own accord that they're ready to retire. But with redistricting upon the legislature in the next legislative session, that's really holding more folks in place for one more term. But even though the retirements have been small in number, they have been substantial in who. And if you look at it, the arguably top two most powerful positions in the State House became vacant through the retirement process, that being House Speaker Dennis Bonin and Appropriations Committee Chairman John Zerwas, both of which decided to opt against running for re-election in 2020. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about the kind of vacuum of, or void of leadership that has left the State House right now. But also some notable retirements in the DFW Metroplex area. Longtime Tea Party activist and conservative hard right lightning rod Jonathan Stickland has decided not to seek another term in the State House, so he's retiring. Bill Zedler of Tarrant County, along with Jonathan Stickland, also of the more conservative-leaning side of the Republican caucus, has decided not to seek another term. And then in Dallas County, of course, Eric Johnson has already left the House, and he is the current mayor of the city of Dallas. The political landscape of the Texas House is one in which, you know, no one can really say with 100% certainty right now which party is going to control the chamber next session. I think that the betting odds are with the Republicans to maintain their control. A couple things have happened in the last 60 days that have really sort of pushed the needle in that direction. The first would be that Donald Trump's approval rating has hit an all-time high since he first took office. And of course, as we all know, what happens on the ballot is dictated mostly by what's at the top of the ballot. But then the second thing that I would say has sort of moved the needle in favor of Republicans is in a special election down in the Houston area in a district that was expected to be competitive. The Democrats kind of laid a little bit of a goose egg. They allowed the Republicans to run away with it with a nice wide margin of a victory. Even though it was a special election and those are easily, I would say, manipulated because they're so low turnout, it was still kind of significant to see Republicans get a big victory in that state House seat. But that doesn't mean that the Republicans are home free. Democrats will make a push to try to take a majority in the State House. It's the first time in over a decade, in fact, that that party has talked about the possibility of having a majority in the State House. The Metroplex is going to have significant political activity. Already, in fact, today, here in Denton County, Representative Michelle Beckley is facing a credible primary challenge that has put her in a position where she has to work hard to win her party's nomination for a second term. And I would say that the same is true of Representative Jared Patterson, coincidentally also a freshman, but up in the Frisco area, he too is receiving a creditable primary challenge, an individual who's actually raised enough money to be competitive in the election, and he's getting pushed and he's having to run hard to defend his seat as well. But really and truly, the bulk of the political activity in the DFW Metroplex is going to happen in November, where potentially as many as 10 seats in the four-county Metroplex that are currently held by Republicans could be targeted to be flipped by the Democrats. And on the vice versa, you have about 5 or 6 seats that the Democrats hold that the Republicans could target to take over. So really and truly, whichever party controls the State House in 2021 is going to be determined largely based upon what happens in the DFW Metroplex. And I'll give you some anecdotal evidence of that. I recently spoke with a friend of mine who's a political operative on the Democrat side of things, and I asked him, I said, okay, Trump's popularity has rebounded. You guys didn't put your best foot forward in HD 28, special election. What do you now think is going to happen in November? What he told me, he said, we're not going to get the majority, Rick, but we're going to come close. Likely what's going to happen is we're going to flip 7 seats, and he gave me 7 specific ones, but then he said we're probably also going to lose 2 districts that are a little too Republican for us to continue to represent. So in all, he had 9 seats flipping hands in November. 7 of the 9 are here in the four-county Metroplex. So this will be a very big player in that process. I mentioned earlier that there's a little bit of a void right now for House leadership, and that's because Dennis Bonin has decided not to seek another term. It has created a vacancy in the speaker's office. Where that's important is typically the speaker would act as the quarterback that would handle the strategy and the guiding of campaign funds for the majority party's reelection effort. And now Republicans don't have that. And they don't have that in arguably the most critical election that they are facing in Texas since probably 2008, when Barack Obama carried a down ballot effort that almost delivered the Democrats a majority in that election. You see different factions lining up within the Republican Party trying to assume that role of leadership, but right now no one or no faction has really emerged as the new quarterback of the team, so to speak. In fact, the Republican caucus, the divide of that caucus, that group of majority members, is so wide right now due to events that have occurred during this interim that it's at unforeseen before levels, and it's not going away. And that divide is preventing the Republican majority from really coalescing together and going out and doing the job they need to do in order to be assured 100% they'll be victorious in November. But by evidence of it's not going away, we're all probably aware over the summer, June, there were some certain events that happened that really threw the Republican caucus into chaos. Those clearly are not going away. In fact, just yesterday, one of the chief participants in those events, he went to social media with a message during the Democrat debate, the most recent Democrat debate, to sort of highlight, in his opinion, the hypocrisy of the Democrat Party, how they talk about treating people one way, but then actually treat them another way. Well, that didn't sit well with one of his Republican colleagues who's on the opposite side of the sort of struggle within their caucus, and he replied on social media to that very message and said, "Oh yeah? Well, when are you going to apologize for XYZ that you did during the summer? Myself and about a dozen colleagues are interested to know." So it is not going away anytime soon. The divide is not going away anytime soon, and it could really potentially have a negative impact on the Republican effort in November, and quite honestly, maybe yield the Democrats one or two more seats than they otherwise would have picked up. I'm going to turn it back to Kate to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Senate.
So in the Texas Senate, certainly less excitement, but the current breakup, and there is some significant movement happening there, potential movement happening there. The current breakdown is 19 Republicans to 12 Democrats. Dan Patrick will continue to lead that body as lieutenant governor, but Democrats are targeting really one seat in particular, and then another Democratic seat is playing into some of the makeup and the landscape of the Senate. The seat that they're targeting is a seat outside of San Antonio and into the rural areas around there and down to the border. That has historically been held by a Democrat, and in the 2018, in a special election in 2018, not during the regular election, but in a special election, because that seat was vacated by the former senator, the Republican Party was able to win that seat. And so for the last 2 years, it's been held by a Republican named Pete Flores. And he's up for re-election in this regular cycle, and that's a seat that Democrats are targeting to win back. Again, it's historically been a Democratic seat, so there's certainly expectation that will flip back, pending a big surprise to a lot of people. Certainly Republicans are targeting it and continue to work it, and they do have an incumbent candidate that could potentially hold that seat. With that shift, as well as a seat in the Valley that everyone's watching that's currently held by Chairman Lucio from Brownsville, and he is facing a challenge from the left, really, and it's a viable challenge from two candidates. I think recent polling suggested that maybe the candidate that people had their eye on, who is the State Board of Education member, who's running against him, might not even be as viable as the third candidate that people haven't been paying as much attention to. And the polling suggested that she was doing quite well in that seat. or in that race so far. So that could shift things a little bit in the Senate because Chairman Lucio has been a swing vote in some cases, and that has aided Republicans as they brought some major bills to the floor, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. There are 2 seats that are open due to retirements. The first is in El Paso. Senator Rodriguez is retiring. That seat will be held by a Democrat. It is an uncontested race from one of the House members in that area. The second is a more surprising development in the last week or 2. Senator Watson from the Austin area has decided to retire to go to be the first dean of the Public Policy School for the University of Houston. And so he's taking on that role and retiring at the end of April, and that will be a special election held in that seat. And that could, again, he's a very kind of middle of the road member in some ways, not always, but could certainly shift things just a little bit. All of that has, while Dan Patrick will continue to oversee the Senate, that has led to the pressures coming from both the Lucio race, where one of his allies may or may not be there in the future, as well as the race in San Antonio, where it might flip back to a Democratic race. That has led the lieutenant governor to perhaps feel a little pressure that could push up against the 3/5 rule, which is required to bring a bill to the floor. And so that has led him recently to start discussing publicly potential to lower that threshold so that the Republican Party would, and that would be a simple majority, to make sure that the Republican Party would still have control to bring things to the floor. So that could be a major shift that we could see going forward, depending on the shakeout of all of these elections. And again, lots of predictions there still.
I'm often asked by high school, college friends who have better, more exciting jobs than I have, if the legislature's only in session every other year and only for 20 weeks at that, what do you do all day? And the reality is that the interim process is still very important to what goes on in the following legislative session, particularly through the interim charges that both the House and Senate receive from their presiding officers. For those who may not be familiar with what an interim charge is, think of it as a homework assignment. It is a topic of interest that either the Speaker or the Lieutenant Governor has that they have bestowed upon a respective committee in their chamber and said, I want you to study this. I want you to do a deep dive into this, and then come back in the form of a written report that will be made available to your entire chamber. Make any recommendations for what might need to be done during the next legislative session on this particular topic. So interim charges really have the potential, and we have seen in the past, to set the stage on various areas of public policy for what is in fact going to occur during the next legislative session. They are, for stakeholders of that legislative process, like the DCTA, they can be a tool, they can be an asset to help promote particular changes in state law that could help you guys to better meet your goals and objectives. They could also, though, you get the wrong type of interim charge and you get the wrong type of conversation that evolves in the committee on that topic, and they could actually become a liability that's going to require a lot of additional work in the subsequent legislative session. So one of the first things we wanted to do was to really get onboarded with the DCTA on the interim charges. And so we went through with staff the interim charges in both the House and the Senate. You're talking about more than 200 individual homework assignments between the two chambers. And what we did is we identified 50 of those 200 that we are currently tracking on the DCTA's behalf, because they either absolutely will be of strong interest, or they have the potential, depending upon how the conversation goes in committee, they could be of interest. So we're tracking 50 on your behalf. Already, there have been some committee hearings in both the House and the Senate covering some of these topics. These topics, they are a broad range, but they include public financing, the ability for local governments and quasi-local governments to be able to access debt in order to build infrastructure, revenue streams. So we're talking about the implementation of Senate Bill 2, which of course was the major property tax overhaul bill that was passed during the last legislative session, but also sales tax as revenue streams. One of the interim charges that's sitting right now before the House Ways and Means Committee is a topic to discuss the viability of taking that extra penny that cities and counties can elect to receive in local option sales tax, and instead of allowing them to use them for the existing purposes, instead require that they redirect them into other areas, particularly further property tax relief. So that's one, as an example, that we will be watching very closely on DCTA's behalf. Now, I don't want to scare anyone right now. Just because something is an interim charge prior to session does not mean it's going to be front and center legislation during the next legislative session. The two certainly are not, bound at the hip, but there is always that possibility, which is why we want to be diligent here during the interim process. There is, of course, also the possibility that more interim charges could be coming. It is very, very common that as we get closer and closer to a legislative session, that both chambers will release second rounds of interim charges. In some cases, might even create new committees specific for one topic that the leader of that chamber feels like has just really risen up the ranks as far as what is and is not important. So we could be getting more in the future, but like I said, for now, we're tracking 50 across, probably about a dozen committees in the House and probably about 6 or 7 committees in the Senate on your behalf. But interim hearings and interim charges are not the only thing going on in Austin. There has been significant news and significant movement of the legislature recently. Specifically, back in January, Representative Giovanni Capriglione, a Metroplex member, he's a South Lake Republican, he was appointed by our outgoing Speaker, Dennis Bonnen, to take John Zerwas's place as chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. So that will be his job for at least the next 10 months. And it is actually a very critical 10 months because, the state budget is north of $200 billion. And a lot of what we ultimately settle on by the end of the legislative session is what gets started right now today. So he will, even if he does not retain that role for the next legislative session, he will still have a significant impact on the state budget that is passed in 2021. John Cyrier was recently appointed chairman of the Sunset Committee. That is a very, very powerful position because every state agency at some point, not necessarily every year, could be once every 6 years or once every 12 years, but every state agency has to go before the Sunset Committee, make their case for why they should continue to exist, and also recommend any changes statutorily that should be made that would allow that state agency to be more efficient in their operations and better deliver their services. And then, of course, that process concludes with, during the following legislative session, we actually have to pass a bill. Let's use the TxDOT as an example. Were TxDOT to be going through sunset right now, we would have to pass a bill during the next legislative session to both enact the recommended changes from the Sunset Committee and then reauthorize the agency to continue for 6, 8, 10, 12 more years. And then, of course, I talked earlier about Gary Gates and his victory down in Fort Bend for a special election state House seat. And that was a pretty positive sign of things to come for Republicans. Also of note is Comptroller Glenn Hager is currently going through a rulemaking process as it pertains to the collection of sales tax revenue from online purchases. That change that he is proposing, and he's sort of in a pause mode right now as he's getting more feedback from stakeholders, but it would result in a different determination from online purchases, which community would be collecting that extra penny of sales tax collections. And there are some municipalities in Texas that really like what he's talking about. There's a couple of municipalities that have some concerns, and that's partly or largely why, like I said, he's just kind of hit the pause button right now. But it's still an issue that's worth watching, especially on the DCTA's behalf. And I'm going to give it back to Kate, and she's going to bring us home from here.
So moving forward, what are we going to do now? We've talked a little bit about some of the things that we are already working on, but now's the time to also start to develop your plans and what does next session look like, and how are you, as Rick mentioned, there are conversations happening right now. How are you a part of those conversations? So we will begin by setting up that plan, working on the legislative strategy, any advocacy plans, and again, there's no better time than to start this right now because things are happening, and we want to go into a session knowing very clearly what our goals are and where we're moving. A brief overview here of what we would be working on. Again, kind of look at what statutes exist now, how they work for you, how they don't, how can we alter them, how do we need to continue that they stay the same. So looking at those and working on how we can positively amend the code in your favor. Identify stakeholders. We have already notified your delegation of the partnership here and look forward to working with them. But there are stakeholders outside of just your delegation as well, people who are working in tandem with you, people who are working alongside you, and that we can make sure we're all moving forward together. We'll, of course, work with bill authors, identify them, find ways to move those through the process in a timely and effective manner. We'll work with staff and all of you to develop resource materials, as well as knowing who to tap for the right conversations, and working with you on DCTA witnesses as those opportunities arise. And then, of course, just remaining mindful of harmful topics and how shifts in discussions, shifts in policy can impact you. So questions?
Well, I know one of the things that we've expressed to our Hillco lobbyists is a deeper desire to have relationships during this interim period for staff and the board to develop relationships right now with all the legislators, especially those that are friendly to transportation and those that are not, so we can educate them. But I think that this is the time that we do that, not at the time that we actually go into session. So part of the charge has been, create an environment where we can go down and meet with the legislators and develop that relationship so that we become a easy name for them to remember and a person one-on-one, and we've expressed that to our Hillco partners.
I'd just like to add that as we were looking at choosing who our partner was going to be, it was important that we take a more proactive, more strategic approach with our state representatives. I think we do a pretty good job in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of strong public awareness of DCTA. We get invited to a lot of initiatives, especially around innovation, and that matters a lot when we apply for competitive grants, because the people that are looking at 200 different proposals, the tendency is to award grants to folks that they know are making a difference, that are stepping up, that are trying to take on challenges, whether it be local or national. On a state perspective, I don't think we've done enough to, and moving forward, we need to do a much better job of increasing our brand recognition in the state. There's a lot of opportunity with state dollars that frankly are not being tapped for transit, that we can do a much better job as a coalition of transit authorities to go after, to potentially rewrite some of the code that would enable us to tap into, in some cases, billions of dollars of funds that are available. So I really want to focus the next couple of years in working with Hillco, and they are considered a heavy hitter. They have a very strong relationship, a broad relationship across the entire legislative community down there. And I think it's our opportunity to not only just target a couple of key initiatives with respect to right-of-way access and insurance and things that are going to directly impact us, but I think just trying to change the mindset that North Texas is growing and Denton and Collin County are growing faster than the majority of the state. And so we need to ensure that we're doing our job to be vocal, to be present, to ensure that when these funding opportunities come up, whether it be at a COG level or a state level, that people are aware of all the dynamic things that are happening in our region, that we get our fair share of the financial resources in the state of Texas. And I'm just really happy with the new partnership and look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I may, Madam Chair and Raymond, I think, with, of course, further guidance and direction and approval from the board, we're very confident with the two objectives that you each outlined. And they really both kind of go hand in hand, in my opinion. But very confident that within, the next 30 days, we can come back to you guys with significant advancement on those topics so that you can see, like you said, Raymond, it really is a long game, a 1, 2, 3 year process, but that we're getting started and we're heading in the right direction on both goals.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
I've got a couple questions,
Yeah.
and I want to thank you guys for the focus on strategy, but I've got some agita going on right now with the comptroller.
You got some what?
Agita, heartburn,
Okay.
anxiety.
Italian.
So what are we doing as an agency to address that change?
Ultimately, at this point, we are monitoring it on y'all's behalf, pending any sort of formal position that this board would adopt that the DCTA would take on the matter.
Gotcha. And when are his comments due?
He pushed back his comment period
Mhm.
in order to receive more feedback from stakeholders on that topic. My understanding, and I will get you a specific date, but it's early April is when his new comment deadline is.
I believe it's April 3rd.
Okay.
And
So-
Councilmember, I can add what I've done too, since they've been so diligent in keeping us aware of the topic. I've reached out to our member communities, because DCTA certainly doesn't want to take a position on an issue one way or the other that has conflicting positions in our member communities.
Mhm.
And so Denton right now is currently not taking a position. The last I spoke with them, they were just monitoring it. City of Louisville, I understand from James Kunke and his conversations with you all that you were very concerned about the issue because of the Falcon Beyond facility here and the negative impact that that can have on Louisville. And then the city of Highland Village had a different approach. They actually saw it as a positive. And I think we see the same type of dynamic in the Texas Municipal League and their membership as well. We see a lot of need for neutrality, I guess, from TML, for example, because of their membership as those opposing positions right now. So that's where we are now, is DCTA monitoring it, taking a position of being neutral, unless we're further directed by the board.
Certainly something we could put on our agenda.
So do we have a budgetary response if we're going to be neutral and take that hit? Because we will be taking a hit.
And I think further data gathering needs to be done on that, to see what that hit will be.
Okay, so you haven't reached out on that? Because I know from just Louisville, DCTA will see somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000 in reduced sales taxes.
I think it's a conversation we need to have at
We can add
this
that to the
board
March
level.
agenda.
Yeah, so,
Would you like that to be added?
I would think that we need to have some sort of response as an agency.
I agree.
And if we, if we don't talk to our member cities and figure out what the budgetary implications are, I think we're putting ourselves at least behind the 8 ball and not having a voice.
It's a discussion that should be had.
And then the next step, of course, would be who's going to be, if this is going to be the change. I mean, I personally think that he's making a legislative change by policy. And of course, the legislators are going to most likely sidestep that. And I don't care which way it ends up, but it needs to be ended up, and we need to have some say in that, I think. So to that point, which party historically has been more amenable to carrying the water for transit? So if we do provide a bill, I get that we've had primarily Republican control for, 20 years now. But when we're reaching out, as we build these strategies, are there going to be certain folks that you think are going to be more likely to carry for us than not?
I think that transit historically has been a bipartisan issue,
Okay.
one that enjoys substantial support from both Republicans and Democrats. Specific to DCTA, I would see at this point, pending further discussion and better understanding of the integral details, I would see no reason to deviate from your bread and butter right now, which has historically been to have Mr. Parker and Chairwoman Nelson in the Senate carry legislation needed to amend your enabling statute. Should there be any legislation on this sales tax topic, and there will be next session, regardless of what happens with the comptroller's rules, I would hypothesize there will be a bill next session on this topic. And that is something that if you guys were in the position of we've got to have legislation next session to clarify this situation, I would say that might be a unique example of where we would want to deviate away from your local delegation and maybe instead go to someone in both bodies who's more of a tax specialist, since it's such a highly technical issue.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, sir?
That helps.
And it kind of depends on your approach too, I think. If you have a big book of things that you're working with, you might not want to load up your local delegation alone, and each individual issue might have a different author that you approach there. But yeah, I think the first step is certainly where you've been.
Yeah. Based on my experience with being down there on this, we're going to take a hit. DCTA is going to take a hit. I don't know how big that is. I know how big it is from Louisville's sales tax dollars. So if staff has not started to prepare for that particular belt tightening, we're going to need to.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned before that they were looking at the whole issue of that extra cent sales tax and changing perhaps what they had previously allocated it for. Does that put us at risk as far as all of the cities who voted to have the half-cent sales tax for DCTA? Is that in play in this?
I would say would have a strong possibility, yes. But again, I don't want to send up the alarm bells because working backwards, there's over 200 interim charges. That does not mean we're going to have 200 big, bold, gonna pass, have to pass bills during the next legislative session. The backstory, if I may be candid for a moment, on that particular idea and that particular discussion rests with some in the legislature, particularly in the House, their desire to go beyond what Senate Bill 2 did, which Senate Bill 2, of course, slowed the growth in local property tax collections. They want to go beyond that, and they want to actually start moving in the opposite direction and reducing local property tax collection. The ideas that they have come up with, though they have not spoken out loud publicly about them, would be to say, take those 2 pennies, and instead of being able to use those for economic development, transportation, and the other allowable uses that currently exist in law today, require that the local governments collecting those extra 2 pennies instead have to use them to buy down their local property. But again, ma'am, that does not necessarily mean 100% we're going to have a new law 2 years from now. But the possibility of it is why we, working with Lindsay, decided this is one we need to watch closely.
Definitely.
I'm sorry, what were you saying, sir?
Conceptually, I don't understand what you're talking about.
So,
Use the collect tax to buy down, to pay down the tax.
the local property tax
So
rate.
reduce the rate, basically. Use your sales tax to reduce the property tax rate.
Yeah, instead of using it for the
Basically
current
telling you how
allowable
to spend your
purposes.
money. Again.
We're being
Again.
advised by legal that we're getting a little into the weeds and off topic, so we're going to need to abandon this conversation.
And
But
we can bring it back as
We
a
do wanna bring it
topic on
back
the agenda.
Because this is, you know, as we were talking, it's gonna be important for DCTA from all aspects.
we will add it to the March agenda.
Thank y'all so much for
Thank you.
coming, yeah, very eye-opening.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank y'all, have a safe trip back. Thank you. Okay, again, because of how we moved things around in our agenda, we do have someone who came in requesting a public comment. And so I'm gonna go ahead and go back to that area. I will remind that it's a 3-minute, right, the 3-minute?
And
Yes.
Brandy at the front of the room will, once the 3 minutes has come up, she'll stand up and wave at you.
Oh,
So
okay.
that way you know when your time is expired. Before you start?
Yeah, or I can go ahead if,
Okay. Do we need to keep that comment?
Oh, no, yeah,
Yeah.
no,
Keep
I
that
was
comment
just.
card?
Oh, well, yeah.
We know
Brandy
we need
needs
to
it.
Why don't you give it to him if you want to?
Okay,
Who
okay,
states
so
his
if
name?
you'll just state your name and address.
Indian giver.
Okay.
I hit this front.
You're actually
You
Well,
can
you're
stay right
fine
where you are.
there. Everyone can see you.
No, Brandy's up front. She's gonna wave at you whenever your 3 minutes
How
has
about if I just sit
expired.
in the middle, that way?
Well, I think right here's a great.
get on my
place.
spot?
Right here.
Come on, right here.
I'm only dangerous backing up. Okay, my name, to start off properly, I shall introduce myself to you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joe Gilbert. I've lived in Denton a little over 35 years. I retired from the city of Carrollton after 21 and a half years. I was supervisor. I worked in the city government with the city manager and department managers of other departments. And I hired my own assistant, and y'all had a position a few years back that came open that fell into my territory. Well, I applied for that job. Well, I got turned down for it, but there was no reason why I got turned down. And I kept asking, nobody knew. Then I just let it go. That's old news. But now, first off, number one, I want to give recognition and compliment to some drivers that I don't think will get me. Number one is Juan, drives Route 4. Number two is Dave, or a lot of people know it as David. He drives Route 4. Will drives Route 7 and Route 4. And I have Victoria that drives either 6, 5, or 3. They're all very good. They help me on and off the bus. And then there's some drivers I got to draw back on. They'll just stand there and they'll watch me struggling trying to get on the bus. And I say, hey, why don't you come over here and help me? I said, that seat don't need any moral support. I need to get on, but I actually started rolling backwards. One of the passengers grabbed me and pushed me in. But that's not the point there too. The issue is, I'm going to say something, and I'm not cracking a joke. I'm being dead serious. But it's a saying. I don't know what time last meeting we had, y'all had it at the transit center. I asked him, I said, have you ever heard about the farmer and his cows? He's looking at me and like, no, sir. I said, okay. I said, every morning, that farmer gets up, 5 a.m., makes his breakfast, drinks his coffee. That's right. So what's he do? He goes out there, he opens the gate. The cows go out. But the cows do one thing. They follow the same path every day. That's what your buses are doing. They are following the same path like cows every day. And they're not going places like, they're not keeping up with the stops. Number one, at Razor Ranch, you got Torchy's and McAllister's. I have to cross over Bonnie Bray and get off at the stop at Sports Academy, then come back across Bonnie Bray and go all the way down the other end where McAllister's is. And then also too, on the other side, or inbound side, the closest stop to Chili's and all them is Winco. That's But, anyway, I think that, you know, maybe, another thing too is, I live on Elm Street down the city. There used to be bus stops on Elm. Y'all took them out. He said, oh, well, you know, we don't get enough riders. And I said, you ain't getting enough riders on the rest of the buses. I said, why didn't you take my stop out? Now, it's 2 miles from my apartment to the bus stop. Whether the weather's bad, good, or whatever, and I have to push this wheelchair. And, you know, you see my hands, I got rheumatoid arthritis. Now, that's a lot of pain when I have to go. And to go to 380, it's all uphill. I've had people stop their cars and get out and push me to the bus stop. And when I go down to Bell in Texas, to the closest bus stop, I have to go down the middle of the street because I can't go down the sidewalks. They're messed up. I had a TWU police officer take me down to the bus stop and drop me off. But anyway, I just think that, you know, I think you can put the stops back on Elm, but you don't need a big bus. Use one of the white buses, the cutaway bus. I think that would be perfect. And I think on Friday and Saturdays, I think the buses should run late with A train. I'm not saying, I made a suggestion that maybe run the routes. Find out which ones has the most riders on it. Cut the others out and run those too. And, I mean, I think that, I'm trying to remember some stuff. Let me see my paper.
You can always come back.
Huh?
You can always come back and send us.
Okay, but anyway,
Yeah.
I just think that, there are some things that could be improved upon, and I think that, this is my opinion, I mean, I'm not no pro at it, but this is my opinion, is I think that the buses are not really being utilized to their full extent. And I think they do that. And add, you know, and another thing, I don't know where y'all are getting some of these drivers. When I was sitting out there at Bell in Texas at the bus stop, me and some TWU students. Route 5 bus comes down Bell, and if there had been a TWU police officer there, she'd have got a ticket. She'd come down and zoom. I was sitting right there, and I said, she ain't gonna stop. Why? I said, she ain't got her emergency flashes on. She come flying right by us, and I was like this way around. She turns and looks and just keeps going. And left us sitting there. And I had a doctor's appointment. So I called down, and they called supervisor. Supervisor sent somebody out in the XS bus and took me to my doctor because I was still 13 minutes late. But I have that issue, Route 4. It's a big problem. A lot of people have trouble with it. And the main concern was the bus schedules don't coincide with the drivers. Like I get a schedule and it says Route 4 comes at Brinker and the Loop at 9:15. I'm there at 5 minutes till 9, so I got plenty of time. And there's 7 people out there. You waiting on Route 2? I said, no, I'm waiting on Route 4. Oh, Route 4 done came and left. I said, no, it's not supposed to be here until 9:15. But its schedule said 9 o'clock.
So I think your comments really will be taken into consideration, and staff will look into this.
And now I look on Route 4 schedule, and now it says 9:06. So, you know, what do you go by?
No, I thank you so much.
I got left stranded at there at Walmart. The driver said, I was there, the lady that, she told Victoria in Route 2. She called him on the radio, and I was listening. And he told her that he would be at Brinker and the Loop in 15 to 20 minutes. I told her, I said, okay, I'll just take him because I can go up to Locust and go down Locust and go home. He never showed up.
Well, thank you so much. I know it was an effort to come out here and to voice your concerns, and I can assure you that we will look into those things.
You know, another thing.
Okay, so I think we're going.
Oh,
to
one more and
10
I'm done.
minutes. Okay, one more.
You need to teach your drivers how to hook up wheelchairs. I'm having to show them how to do it. If y'all want to hire me, I'll teach you.
I was waiting for that. I knew that that was coming.
You knew that one was coming, didn't you?
I knew that one. Well, God bless you, sir. Thank you so
But,
much.
yeah, but, I mean, there's more, but y'all get the point
Yes,
without
sir.
having to really go into more than anything else. But that, you know, like I said, there's a lot of other people complaining about it, but I told them, I said, why are you complaining to me? You need to go to people that will listen. I can't have no authority to do anything.
Well, you
So I'm
raised it.
speaking for myself.
I know that.
And I've rode in buses for many years, and I've known pretty much all the drivers when they first started, and, you know, things like that. And that's my only way around.
Yes, sir. I understand that. That was my only way around as a child. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yes,
Appreciate
sir.
y'all listening to me.
Absolutely.
I'm not no speaker of the house, but, you know.
You're
Pretty
speaking
good,
of
you're
your
pretty
will
good,
right
you're
now.
pretty
I
good.
just did the best I could.
You did well.
You did extremely well. And thank
Okay,
you so
well,
much.
thank y'all
Thank
very
you.
much,
you.
and I
Yes.
appreciate y'all's time, and, yeah, I would, you know, get those in consideration.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Okay, well, thank y'all for listening and.
Absolutely.
And giving me your time.
Yes, sir. Anytime.
Y'all
Good day. Thank
have
you.
a good blessed week, and y'all be safe.
Likewise.
You
Thank
as
you so
well.
much.
Thank you.
Have a good
very
day.
much.
So we're gonna go ahead and break for lunch, right?
The lunch is available in the TNT conference room. You can grab that and bring that back to your place, and then we can continue on with the agenda.
A working lunch.
A working.
What a sweet.
Diane. I did, Diane.